Hello everyone, welcome back to Xero API's YouTube channel. My name is Chris Knight and I'm joining you from Denver, Colorado. The goal in today's video is to get you up and running with the xero-ruby gem. We want to make this as simple and fast as possible to get you writing your first API calls. So we've got a Rails application which has a bunch of great examples, but today I'm going to be going through our Sinatra tutorial. This is a very simple app, it's all session based, and let's get started. So the first thing is to read a little bit about Sinatra. It's a domain-specific language for creating very simple web applications with Ruby. So if you hop over to your terminal, let's make sure we've got the right version of Ruby. It's going to need at least 2.7. And then from there, go to the developer portal. And you're going to go to My Apps in your dashboard, click New App. Sinatra, it runs on port 4567 by default. And then I'm going to give it a route called /auth/callback. So let's create this. It's going to give me an app ID up here, but from that I'm going to quickly generate a secret, and then I'm going to come back to this as soon as I have a place to put those credentials. So the next piece you're going to want to look at is the scopes, and you're going to need to determine which scopes your application needs in order to do the business logic that you're building. Main one you're going to definitely want is offline access. This is going to tell the Xero API to return to a refresh token. In addition to these OpenID connect scopes, and that's sort of an additional spec on top of OAuth 2. It's going to allow for our API to return user data, so you can implement things like single sign-on. But for the purposes of our tutorial, we're going to need the scopes account transactions and accounting.settings. So now we actually just want to clone and run the app. So let's clone that into git clone. Let's call this Xero Sinatra. So if we go into that repository and open it up, it's pretty simple. Sinatra is a great way to show just how to get started with Ruby and gems in particular. We really just got one main file. What this does is requires the Sinatra framework, a reloader tool so we don't have to restart our server in between code changes. Then we import the xero-ruby gem and 4 additional helpers that are going to make this tutorial just a little bit easier to follow. Next thing we have here is a session secret. You can change this to any unique string, especially if you're using this outside of a development environment. The rest of this is just a couple setups for our views and our session. Then we get to the good stuff. So we've got this credentials hash, and I'm just going to kick back to the README real quick. Important step here is we got to rename sample.env to just .env, and then we have to replace it with the 4 required parameters. So let's do that real quick. We're going to rename this, drop the sample. It's going to turn this into a file that will be git ignored, so we're not checking that into git or any other version control. And now we've got client ID, secret, redirect, and scopes. So we're going to get the first 3 of those from our My Apps dashboard. Redirect URI, our client ID, and our client secret. And from my previous research, I've already got those scopes set up. And those are all just going to be put in as space-separated values in a string. All right, so I saved that. I've got my 4 variables. If we look back at the code, we can see the credentials is going to be a static hash with all of our dynamic credentials. So checking back in the README, we've got steps 1 through 4 done, and we're about halfway done with step 5. So bundle install is going to look at the gem file and make sure we've got all these dependencies installed. And then bundle exec ruby xero-app.rb is going to run the xero app RB file in the context of all the gems that we just installed. So if I set this up correctly, we're going to be running on port 4567. And so how this is structured, we've got a simple helper here, a method called xero-client, which is going to return a variable called @xero-client that's memoized, meaning it's only going to instantiate the first time. And that's really the crux of the whole Xero-ruby SDK. We call Xero-ruby API client.new, and we pass in a named parameter called credentials, which is our credentials hash up here. So from that, we are then able to call authorization URL, and in our home view, which is a simple directory up here, we're first going to display our data if we have it, which we don't, or else we're going to display the auth URL with a nice branded logo. So if I click that, you can kind of see at the bottom the URL that's generated is our full authorization URL. This is going to kick me to Xero's identity server, in which it will say, hey, Sinatra API tutorial will want access to my organization data and my user account information. And this is all generated based off the scopes that you passed into the client that were used to generate that authorized URL. So I'm just going to add my demo company first. And if all goes well, it's going to kick me back to the redirect URI that I defined in my application. Back on my Xero app RB, my second route down here is the Auth Callback. And what that's going to do is come in, and I'm going to have access to my URL params. This is a Sinatra helper. And I'm going to take my xero-client and I'm going to call the method get token set from callback, pass it in the params. That's going to actually give me a token set, which I'm going to store directly in the session. And then I'm going to kick myself back to the home page, where it's going to rerun this code, decode the whole token set, and display me a couple variables where I'm decoding those jots so I can see the publicly accessible data in them. So from that, I've got my access token down here, my ID token up here. You can see I've got my email, my first name, last name. The decoded access token shows some really great helpful information like the expiration time, the UTC timestamp, as well as like which scopes I authorize as a Xero user for this access token to interact with. And then we've got some other metadata on there, like how long the token lasts for, the refresh token, and once again the scopes. So the rest of this app is super basic. I really just wanted to show how simple it was to get your first API calls. So another concept that's new in OAuth 2 is having multiple orgs connected to the same access token. So if I go to add connection here, that's going to redirect me to the existing authorized URL, in which I can either continue with my one organization I've already whitelisted or add myself another org I'm connected with. And so now for the Chris Knight user in Xero, I've got an access token that can write to two of my orgs. So if I go to list connections, you can see I'm connected to two different orgs here. The next helper route we've got in there to show is refresh token. So tokens are only going to last for 30 minutes. Within a token set, you're going to have a refresh token. So it's important to save that whole token set that comes back, because the refresh token set is going to expect that whole token, not just the refresh token. So with the xero-client refresh token set method, I pass in the existing token set stored in my session, and I replace it with the new one that comes back. And so if I keep hitting this, you're going to see the expiration just keep jumping up, because I'm essentially going from 29 minutes and 58 seconds to 30 minutes, 30 minutes. In addition, we've got a great disconnect endpoint, which is going to allow you to manage environments where you don't want to have more than one connection on an access token. While the one-to-many access token relationship is very great, sometimes it just doesn't fit an app's user experience. So now if I list my connections again, I'm now just connected to the demo company. And to show that, we set the token set on the client, and then we call xero-client.disconnect, and from the xero-client's connections, we take the first one and we give it the connection ID, not to be confused with the connection's tenant ID, also known as organization ID. And then we put the connections that are remaining in a variable, and we spit us out to the disconnect view. And just to show some super basic accounting API calls, put in two calls here. One is get invoices, and all that's going to do is call the xero-client, make sure that the token's set on it before, and then call the accounting API, and then the get invoices method. And for each API call to a protected resource, the first parameter is going to always be the tenant ID. And so the connections helper method is going to look up all the connections and then show you which orgs you have access to write to. And so I recommend storing this in some kind of active tenant ID field on a user, or using your data store to really make sure you're writing to the right org if your user has authorized multiple. So I pass in my demo company tenant ID, and I call .invoices. It's going to pluck the invoices off of the body response, and I'm returning this variable to the invoices view. And I'm just using a nice inspect method to iterate through each one. Last but not least, get organization. This is just going to show me super basic info about the demo company or the org that I'm passing in my tenant ID to. So that's xero-client.accounting-api.get-organizations and passing it the tenant ID. All right, so thanks again for joining today. We're really active on GitHub. If you've got any issues or comments with either the starter apps or the gem itself, just pop an issue in our respective repos with as much context as you can. We're really trying to get this up to par with our previous community SDK of ZeroWiser. A lot of you have been active in the comments, and we've implemented some great additions. We're up to 2.1. We've got some great examples on options, filterings, wheres. Everything is now ported to big decimal, so we really listen to your feedback and really excited about this repo and can't wait to see what you all build with it. So drop me a note, and thanks again for joining.